Hi there. I wanted to make sure that you guys kind of had some background as you're going into the beginning of school. And since you have to read 12 Years a Slave, so you can understand kind of what my purpose in assigning this was, and really to kind of help clarify any questions about the introductory assignment and then the upcoming essay. So this, you can kind of view this as a background. This is not exhaustive. We're going to be talking about this periodically in class. You'll find me making references to 12 Years a Slave as a way of kind of being a bulletin board that we can kind of pin concepts about slavery and how that system worked in the South, because this is incredibly important to understand the United States, its economic development, and really the racial implications that we deal with today. I don't know if you've noticed on the news, racism is a big topic, right? We went from the election of Obama in '08 with, oh, racism's dead, to now we have a Unite the Right rally and white supremacists, and we've got this huge question about President Trump, right? And the things that he says and tweets and that sort of thing. So this is an incredibly relevant conversation. And we don't understand where we are today if we can't look back and see the development, right? Think of this as kind of psychological history, if you will. So that's really kind of where we're going to dive into. And there's a lot of complicated factors, and I don't pretend to have easy answers or even really any answers. But what I want you to see is how we've ended up where we are in 2018 and how the system of slavery kind of developed. So I hope you really kind of walk away with that, because it's incredibly important to understand the United States. So the first thing I kind of wanted to do was to talk about this idea of slavery, the expansion of slavery. And I'll probably share the link to the Henry Louis Gates kind of snippet where he talks about the development of the cotton economy. And we'll talk about this when we get to lecture. But suffice it to say, you have a period, in the late 1700s where tobacco is playing out. Cotton hasn't become this huge popular thing. We don't quite have the full development of the factory system, so the demand for raw materials isn't quite as great. And so there's kind of this hope that slavery will just kind of phase itself out, if you will. Except, what's going to happen is the cotton economy is going to emerge, and that's going to coincide with Western expansion. And you've got some economic factors, some boom and bust cycles. You've got the early wave of industrialization. All of these things kind of develop together. And what you end up seeing is the development of kind of an internal slave trade, right? That takes people from this kind of eastern coast where the tobacco has played out and begins to send the slaves over here to this region of kind of the western part of the United States, at least western part as it existed in 1850 or whatever. So you can kind of get a sense for how people were being moved around. And this is particularly dramatic. I mean, you really have these two waves of separation, one taking people from Africa, bringing them to the colonies, to North America, where they're dealing with language differences and cultural differences and shock and awe and this trauma of being ripped away from everything they know. And then you have this period of roughly 100 years or so where people recover, right? And things kind of settle into a pattern. And so when we talk about the American Revolution and we talk about the dilemma of, all men are created equal and yet we have slaves, right? Which is, we're right to look critically at that. But you also have to understand that we can't take our present ideas back then. When they're writing these things, they're looking at a system of tobacco that they think is on its way, it's in decline. They don't predict this massive industrial system. They don't predict the cotton economy. And so they kind of make some compromises, thinking that they can push the hard conversations off to another day when there's less economic reasons, and when they're less in crisis, when they're not facing, a revolution and a new nation and all that kind of stuff. And so because the cotton economy emerges in this kind of new republic period, what you're going to see is this massive migration of people within the United States, primarily African Americans. And you can see, I mean, this is the Confederate States, right? This is the southern part of the United States. And so this makes it, kind of gives you a sense for where the hotbeds of slavery existed, like where people were being taken from these areas over here to this area here around Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. And so, I do want to point out, since we live in Texas, the eastern part of Texas, maybe not so much the Dallas area, but when you get to the eastern side, slavery was kind of a big economic factor, right? So one of the things you'll hear me refer to periodically is how Texas kind of has this mixed identity, where we're part Southern Confederate, and all the things that go with that. And then we're part Western cowboy. And so that's kind of an interesting, kind of unique aspect. And I'm not a big exceptionalist person, but that is kind of exceptional for Texas. I did want to show you, so when we talk about slavery, and some of these are pictures I pulled from the internet. These pictures here on the bottom are pictures I've taken on my travels, right? So I went to the Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is this down here. This is what we refer to as the lynching memorial. But they have a memorial to the trauma of slavery, to being ripped and put on these ships and what that does to people. You've got, this is, some shackles from the Civil War Museum that's at the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia. Here's a picture of a lash, that I took at the National African American Museum, and a paddle. So when you when you read Solomon Northup talking about his initial capture and he's being beaten with a paddle, this is what he's getting beaten with, okay? You can only imagine how bad that would hurt, right? And these pictures up here, this is a famous picture, and this gentleman's name escapes me, but they took a picture of his back to kind of depict like what the impact of slavery was. And this is a picture of a slave family. And you can see it's a pretty hard life. It's pretty miserable. When we talk about cotton, this is what a cotton sack was. Okay. And that gives you an idea for, when you're hearing about Patsy being so incredible at picking cotton, this small woman was dragging around the sack. Right. So imagine being out in a field, right, and having to deal with picking those sacks of cotton. And you can see here, everyone was involved. It's a horrific system. There's just no way around it. And there's economic motives for it, which we'll go into a little more detail on. But I wanted you to kind of have those images because, when you're reading Northup, he does a really good job of describing it, but I want to be sure that you kind of have some images to go along with that. And I'm not going to jump into this too much, but I do want to point out that the fugitive slave laws existed for a reason. Remember, slavery was an economic necessity in the 16 and 1700s, going into the 1800s. One of the reasons why we have the Civil War is because when you're talking about ending slavery or limiting slavery, you're talking about taking away one group of people and their economic power. And I realize that sounds, it doesn't sound like it is a class-based argument. But I think you have to understand slavery within the context of that. If you don't understand that slavery was tied to one group's economic well-being, then you have trouble understanding why people would do what they want to do. It's easy to be critical of people. Well, how could they beat slaves? How could they own slaves? How could they do this? Well, when you have children to feed and you want to leave money for your kids, when you want to make sure they're educated, when you're trying to work your way up in the world, people can do things that maybe, it's just human nature, right? So we're running into kind of this complicated situation. And I think that makes it very important to understand, that you have socially this kind of economic anxiety that's happening with, you can't take my slaves because then how will I make money? How will I grow cotton? How will I keep my house? How will I feed my kids? And then you have this political environment that says that the politicians, some of whom didn't like slavery, some of whom, George Washington freed his slaves. Okay. So you have these people that are making these laws, and yet they have to kind of work within the system that's there, right? So you have the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793. And the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793 is not as bad as some. Okay. I mean, it definitely gives people, where you have to return slaves, that you can't, obstruct somebody from returning their slaves. But really, it's a pretty fundamental kind of fugitive slave law. And it's meant really to make the southern states happy so that they know that, because in 1793, you have people up north that are opposed to slavery, right? So you do definitely have this kind of idea going on as far as that's concerned. Then you have the anti-kidnapping law. So by 1840, we definitely have this idea that, that kidnapping is a problem, that, and this factors into the cotton market economy, the fact that the international slave trade is over. That's part of the Great Compromise, right, which we'll talk about. And so the demand for slaves as the cotton economy is booming means that people in the South are doing whatever they can to get, to get slaves, right, and to, continue to develop that system and all that sort of thing. Now, where it really gets dirty is when you get to the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act, which significantly limits. So the one big difference between 1793 and 1850 is the penalty for people that refuse to assist, right? Essentially, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is going to put people really in a position where they almost have to return slaves. And this becomes a huge, like how can, if you're talking about the states' rights argument and you're talking about the right of states and individuals to own slaves, how can you then tell people up in Massachusetts that they have to return people they think are escaped slaves? And this is kind of where the dilemma is coming in, And so this is a picture of kidnapping. This was one of the images in the intro assignment. Here's the couple of the images with the fugitive slave law and warning. There's a lot of concern going all the way through the 1800s. Now, you gather from reading Northup's story that he was a little bit naive about that sort of thing, right? That he was less aware of that. And he definitely kind of lives in this, I'm going to go about my business kind of bubble as he's, as he's living his life. And then he gets kidnapped, right? And so one of the things I think is particularly interesting is, and this ties into the intro assignment, is I want you to know that it's not just Northup's story, that Northup is not the exception, he's the rule. Right. And you've got several, had you read like an excerpt or a chapter from Frederick Douglass's narrative, that's Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, that's a picture of her as an older woman, and Lewis Hughes. And so you had to read those narratives, and those are first person accounts. Those actually happened to them. But I also had to read a little bit of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And if you noticed in 12 Years a Slave, there's a couple places that Solomon Northup throws shade at her because this is a white woman. Now, arguably, she lived on the border between Kentucky and Ohio. So she lived on the side that was free, that was in Ohio, but she could literally cross the river and see slavery, right? Her father was a minister, very strong anti-slavery person, but she also had a sister, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, had a sister that married into a slave-owning family. So this is somebody who is acquainted from not the African-American experience, but from the white American experience that is, kind of seeing what slavery does. So she writes this book, and I put kind of a copy from the original, The Life Among the Lowly. And I want to kind of call your attention to the fact that her story is not first person. It's second, it's a third person account. She's writing about something and she's actually fictionalized it. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have basis in truth. So you can read Uncle Tom's Cabin and walk away with a pretty good depiction of how things were. But she also romanticizes it because she's writing for a white audience. She's a white woman. She's definitely trying to communicate a great deal of sympathy. And there's a term that I want you to be familiar with, which is the concept of paternalism. The idea that I can take care of you. Paternal means, fatherly, right? So if you think in terms of your parents who are going to take care of you, right? Provide your needs, right? Help you get through things. So Uncle Tom's Cabin has this paternalistic approach to it that the first person accounts and Solomon Northup's account don't have. These are stories of people finding their own way through it. So when you're talking about historiography, the things that we do as historians, the firsthand accounts are far more reliable because they're telling us how it was for them. We see them working through their own systems, their own structures, their own struggles, right? We see their perspective of how this system worked. Harriet Beecher Stowe's story is not invalid. In fact, it's incredibly important to kind of the overall frustration with slavery and slave owners in the southern states. And one of the things that you see developing throughout the 1850s is a lot of people, a lot of northern politicians, a lot of northern voters look at the southern United States and are like, okay, really, we need to move on past this. Stop trying to tell us this is this great system because we know it's not, right? Not only do we have these first person accounts, but, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which women were reading in their living rooms, right? I mean, these middle-class women that had just enough time to sit down and read a book, they were reading these things and they were appalled by what they read. And you combine that with the first person accounts. So you can kind of think of this as Uncle Tom's Cabin as the kind of the media sensationalization of what are actually true stories. And we see that all the time today where you have, you have true stories of harassment or brutality. And what it takes is the sensational story. Harvey Weinstein, for instance, NFL players kneeling to make us go, oh, wow, that's really a thing. And so that's really actually kind of what you have happening in microcosm in the 1800s. And so I kind of wanted to point out the contrast between those. And I hope that you kind of dug into that and kind of see where they're the same, where they're different, because I think it's important for you to recognize that. And then to kind of move into a background of Northup. Just kind of, you have this idea of him coming from Saratoga Springs, which is right around here. This kind of image shows you kind of where he was. His family was middle class. Clearly, if you read the book, you get a picture that while he was free and he had a great deal of liberties, he was not equal. Now, he doesn't seem to be resentful of the lack of equality in New York. He kind of has this sense of it's all going to get better eventually. I just have to work hard enough and show that, it's going to get better for my kids, right? If I just work hard. And so I think that's part of the kind of dissonance that he experiences when he gets kidnapped, is that he has such faith in the American system that if I just work hard, it's going to get better for my kids. He knows that he's treated different. He knows that being a darker skin color means he's different. But at the same time, he believes in this American dream that if we just keep working, it's going to get better. And then he gets kidnapped, right? And this slide kind of shows you the route that they take going to Washington, D.C., then coming around and going in through New Orleans, ending up in what is called Rapides Avo. Yeah, my French is terrible, but this area right here. And I kind of included this image that I found through a Google search on some of the trails. So when he talks about the trails that he travels, this kind of gives you an idea. So there were trails throughout this area. So we're talking about this kind of central part of Louisiana, not terribly far from Texas. I also circled down here when he works on the sugarcane plantations. This is where he's traveled to. So kind of gives you an idea of the areas we're talking about. And kind of when he talks about going on a trail, and understand too that this environment is pretty rough. I don't know if you've been to New Orleans or any place like that. It can get pretty crazy, as far as the environment there. And the few number of trails kind of indicate that, right? I've also included a picture. This is a photo of the original Epps house. So I don't know if when you read about Edwin Epps and his home on Bayou Boeuf, that, you might have pictured this plantation, which, as best as I can tell, is either similar to Ford's plantation or is actually Ford's plantation. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that kind of gives you an image. So there's a clear economic difference between Ford and Epps, okay? Epps is not nearly as well-to-do. He's up and coming. He's working hard. Ford is a much more established planter, right? And so, when you're talking about Epps and his home, this is what you're talking about. This is a pretty basic plantation. And we'll talk about kind of the differences between different groups of people. This is, they've moved his home. This is kind of the original structure that they've renovated and kind of repaired. And then again, like I said, this is probably, similar to what Ford's plantation looked like. So let's go over the intro assignment. So basically the intro assignment is due August 30th. You will take a quiz the next day on August 31st. Okay. So this is the notorious 12 Years a Slave quiz. This is where, I really try to make sure that you've read, right? So you have to basically answer the following questions based on this introduction. What happened to Solomon Northup? Blah, 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 blah. And you've got enough, if you've started the book, if you've looked at the intro stuff, you've got enough to answer that question. You have a general idea. I mean, frankly, you could watch the movie and answer that question. Okay. So that's kind of a softball. So you should be able to handle that. The next one gets a little more complicated. Create a chart or a Venn diagram comparing the four narrative selections listed. Okay, so the questions that were embedded with the different sections were kind of a guide to help you think about the narratives. Okay, what is the same? What is different? You can do this artistically. You can do it digitally. I don't have a preference. Okay, but I want to see evidence that you read each of those chapters. Basically, it was 4 chapters that you had to read from different authors. You should have an idea what they talk about, okay? And these can be similarities of gender, of race, of first person versus third person. Like, you can really, just what are the differences between them? I want you to see that. And then particularly go into the questions that were italicized regarding the Fugitive Slave Acts and the warnings given to African Americans. In other words, I want you to kind of dig into what is the Fugitive Slave Act? Like, what is it doing? What are the fundamentals? What are the differences between them, right? And how were people responding to that? In other words, you've got these Fugitive Slave Acts in place that allow for people that own slaves to go after slaves that have run away. And yet you also have this fundamental question about what it means to be an American. And if you're a free African American, if you're a free Black American in New York, what rights do you have? And how do the Fugitive Slave Acts protect those, not protect those? So think in terms of that, because I think it's very important for you to understand, because one of the foundational points of Solomon Northup's story is this question about, aren't I an American too? Like, don't I have the same rights, fundamentally that you have, the same right to make my children's life better, And so then by September 10th, you'll have an essay. Okay. This is kind of a synthesis essay. This is worth about 40 points. So you're going to want to really make sure that you're paying attention to this. And basically, this is talking about the key arguments Northup makes about the destructive and negative effects of slavery on both Blacks and whites. What is the strongest evidence of this negative impact? Okay. And make sure you're making references to the book. You'll want to think in terms of, how, start by creating an outline or notes or a chart or something. What are the arguments he makes about the negative impacts of slavery? And this is the thing that I love about 12 Years a Slave. It's absolutely a sociological study. Okay. It looks at how slavery impacts African Americans, how it impacts whites. I mean, even Northup talks about if he'd been able to stay at Ford's, where there was some respect for him as an individual, right? Where there was an opportunity for success, he might have been more willing to accept the state of slavery. The problem is, the nature of slavery, where he doesn't truly own himself, makes it so that he gets crossways with Tibbets, and then he ends up with Epps, and then you have the very unfortunate story. Then you also have one that talks about slave narratives and what is their purpose, right? What are they trying to say? So what do you think Northup's purpose in writing this narrative, right? What is he trying to accomplish? And then how do you support that? So one has to do with, is very evidence-based, where you go to the text, what argument is Northup making? The other one is, what do you think is his purpose of this narrative? What is he trying to show? And so you kind of have two different options there. And so I kind of wanted to give you a choice rather than just making you do one. They're kind of similar, but there's some subtle differences between them. So I hope this helped you kind of understand what it is you need to do as far as your assignment. And I look forward to talking to you about it.